we've been moving through Galatians, following what Paul had to say to the church that's in what is now modern-day Turkey, and how he was reminding them of the limitations of what they were trying to do by adhering to the law, and how that really wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to help them at all, and they just needed to rely on the blessing that they had because of their adoption through Christ, and that it was their faith in him that made it so that they received justification. But he's continuing to try to convince them of this because he doesn't want them moving backwards and leaning on these doubts that they have that Jesus is enough. That's what their concern is. Well, how can that be? There must be something I have to do. But no, they had what they needed. And this is still what we need in order to quell our own doubts. God has released us from the bonds of our old lives and of the law. We don't have to turn back to our old patterns of self-destruction and enslavement. And so let's see what Paul had to say about this, where we'll be today. We'll be in Galatians chapter 4. And if you have a Bible, maybe you've already opened up to Galatians chapter 4. If you would like to use a paper Bible, I would ask maybe Ellie to fish them out for us, because I forgot once again to put them on the counter, and they're in that closet back there. So if anybody else needs one, it looks like it's just you, so if you want to go ahead and grab one, or you just follow along. All right. I mean, if you had an electronic device, I would normally say you can go ahead and use that, but you can't today because the internet's not working right, and neither's that. So it's not something to be leaned on apparently. But I caught it. I didn't spill my water, so we're good. This will make for a good video, I think, too, because it'll really fit along with what we build this church around. Things don't always go perfect, and that is perfectly fine, because it's still the message that we're presenting that matters more than any of these little things. So we'll get through it, and we'll just bear with it as we go and really focus on what matters most, which is what Paul has to say here in Galatians chapter 4, where we're starting with verse 8. He says, "Then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those things which by nature are not God's. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain." So Paul starts out by talking about the situation that the Galatians were in before he had arrived there, and how they were idolaters, how they were pagans at that time, and that they didn't know the truth about God. And so, of course, there is sort of an innocence to ignorance. It doesn't actually excuse anything, but it does just explain it, that they couldn't know God because they hadn't heard about him yet. And so, yes, they did fall into the pattern of worshiping other things instead. And Paul does explain elsewhere. In 1 Corinthians, he talks about this a bit, of how those things that were worshipped by the ancient peoples, these idols that they would bow down to, pray to, make sacrifices to, they really weren't anything at all. There were no other gods for them to actually be worshiping. And so in talking about that, he was in keeping with the tradition of the Old Testament prophets too, who had made that same point, and who had said it's not worth anything more than the material it's made out of. But of course, the other thing that Paul does talk about in 1 Corinthians is how, while that is the case, there is still an inspiration behind those idols, because it's demonic, and how things then that are sacrificed to idols are actually sacrificed to demons. And so what he meant by that is, it's not that he was saying that there was a demon named Zeus and another demon named Athena or something like that. He was saying that it was the enemies of mankind who had inspired this system and who had helped people by tempting them in these desires to worship these things that weren't the actual one true God who deserves to be worshipped. And so that was the situation that they were in. But it's also the situation that everyone finds themselves in. It wasn't just these people at that point in time. This is a human problem, because those idols, all they really were the mirrors of human desire. We all have these things that we want, the things that we commit our lives to. And so maybe, again, they don't go by names like Hermes and Hera, but they are those things that we put in the center of our lives. Whether it is something like a career, or our sense of identity, or relationships that we have, or an ideology that we are committed to, whatever those things might be that we wrap our lives around, the places that we devote our hearts to. And it's because we want to dominate our world. We want those things so that we can say, this is how things should be. But then what ends up happening with them, of course, is that they end up dominating us because we become consumed by them, in bondage to them. That's the situation that exists for everyone. For modern people, just as much as it did for those Gentiles in Galatia before they had become Christians. But of course, that was where everything changed. It was at the cross. That was where they came to know God, to discover the power above all other powers, who came down to free humanity from our failures and all of those other worthless pursuits, in order to make us, like we talked about last week, God's children who have been liberated and able to give up all those counterfeits for the reality. And as Paul also says here, what that really depends upon, us knowing God, is the fact that we've been known by God. Now, that does mean two different things, because for us to know God, that's coming from ignorance. Again, we didn't at one point, but then we discover the truth. God is never ignorant of anything. He knows everything. He's always known us, but what this is referring to is his desire for us, apart from which we have no hope. He wanted us to know him, wanted a relationship with us. That's why Jesus came. The way the Apostle John talks about it is in 1 John chapter 4:19, where he says, we love him because he first loved us, enabling us to rest in his grace toward us, which is what we should do, but again is what we struggle with. That's what was wrong with the Galatians, is that they had escaped from all of that, but then they doubted that it was good enough. They figured there's got to be something more we have to do, because that's what they were used to. And so they fell right back in. It was under a different guise, because it was no longer the worship of idols, but it was still attempting to follow all these rules and procedures and calendars and everything else that now they were taking from Judaism. But it was still the same problem, is them trying to be in control, and so they wound up being controlled. And that was not actually doing them any good. And so Paul wants to remind them of where they had started out. And that's what he does in the next section, Galatians chapter 4, verse 12. Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. You have not injured me at all. You know that because of physical infirmity I preached the gospel to you at first, and my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear you witness that if possible you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? So Paul is doing here something that he had done previous in this letter as well. He's providing some autobiographical detail. He's talking about his own experience in order to make a point. The trick that we have to deal with here is the fact that we don't know any of the detail at all, because he's talking to the people who were actually involved in the situation. They didn't need to be told, and so we don't get a very complete record here. The only thing we can even begin to guess is, first of all, it was something physical, and second of all, whatever that might have been maybe had something to do with his eyesight, because he maybe references that by talking about how they would have been willing to give their eyes for him. But there's also an argument to be made that that's just kind of an idiom from the time period, and it could have just referred to anything in general. So we don't know, but what we can at least tell from here is that the Galatians learned to love Paul in spite of that infirmity, whatever it was. And actually that they learned to love him because of it. Because he used his weakness in order to introduce Christ's strength. So whatever he was struggling with, whatever he was suffering from, it had taken him to that region, and he saw that and everything he was going through as an opportunity to present the gospel to them. And so maybe this means that it is the same context, and again, whatever he was suffering from is the same as what he talks about in 2 Corinthians. Because it's there he talks about how he had this thorn in the flesh that was giving him so much trouble, and he prayed for relief from it, but God wouldn't give it. And instead, Christ said, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. He didn't get an answer there. And whether this was the same issue or not, we can know that Paul would have prayed for relief, but he didn't receive it. At least not immediately, if he ever did. And that's pretty telling, because here he is. Paul is an apostle. Paul is someone who was a worker of miracles. They had been performed through him. But he can't get a miracle for himself in order to be healed. Can't get that answer because he was being told he didn't need a miracle. He needed Jesus. Even he had to have that reminder. But he uses it in order to give it to all the rest of us that our struggles, they do discourage us. And the things that we go through and the answers to prayer that we don't receive the way that we would want to receive them. But they don't have to overcome us. Because whatever they are, they haven't overcome Christ. Because again, it's not about us, and it's not about what we give, and it's not about what we earn. It's about him. And so if we see what we're going through that way, then we can recognize, as Paul did, that it's an opportunity. Something that we can use in order to show the Lord to. Again, that whole idea from 2 Corinthians 4:7 that we talk about here, having treasure in these jars of clay. The jars take a beating, but the treasure's still inside. That's what still needs to be shared. And so that's what Paul is talking about here, and also telling to the Galatians, I didn't take anything from you, even in that situation. I was still trying to give to you. These people, these false teachers are coming in. They're the ones who are making demands of you. So why are you treating me like an enemy? A lot of the stuff he has to say here is pretty harsh. Not just in this passage, but throughout this letter. The thing we do have to recognize is that it wasn't in a vacuum. It wasn't him just saying this to people randomly and being confrontational. These were, again, that's why he's sharing, reminding them of what happened when he'd been there the first time. They knew how much he loved them. And that was what gave him kind of some social capital, some credit to be able to be this direct and actually go straight to the heart of the issue, was because he'd built a foundation of a relationship. And Christians sometimes struggle with this, I think on both sides of this issue. You have some who will kind of take the tack of just being honest and really using that as a reason to be kind of confrontational and to attack people. And I don't really think that that's good enough. I think we should, like Paul, be trying to establish relationships with the people that we're trying to reach, especially if we have something challenging to say. Because if we don't do that, if we don't let them know how much we actually care about them, if we don't make that clear to them, then all they're going to do is be defensive. And they're not actually going to listen. But if we establish that first, then even if we are saying something that's difficult for them to hear, they're going to have a better idea of the place that it's coming from, and they might be just a little bit more willing to listen to what it is that will actually change their lives. So they need to know that we're not their enemies when we tell them the truth. Of course, that's the other side of it, though, is that there are other Christians who aren't willing to tell the truth because the only thing that they're focused on is their version of being loving, which is really nothing more than being nice. And that's not good enough either. And if people were going to err to one or the other side of this, I'd actually prefer that they were a little too harsh and be telling the truth than not telling the truth, which is not kind at all because it's leaving people to their condemnation. There are things that have to be presented, truths that have to be told. We have to stand on them, that there is sin, that everyone is accountable to God, that they need to know that because there's only one way to be rescued from it. But we should be trying to speak that truth in love. It's the balance between those things. And Paul had done that. Again, maybe a little bit difficult to see because he's got a biting tongue here. But again, they knew him. And that's where it was coming from. That's why he could be honest the way that he was, as he really displays his passion for Christ. And that's kind of what comes up then in this next section, what we get from verse 17. He says, they zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, that you may be zealous for them. But it is good to be zealous in a good thing always, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I labor in birth again until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I have doubts about you. Passion for a cause can be an inspiring thing, and so can be dangerous because it can be inspiring on its own, kind of regardless of what the cause is. What I mean by that is if you get a person who's charismatic enough, they can draw people to themselves even if they're not saying something that's very good. And that was what Paul was seeing in these churches with these false teachers, that they were coming in and presenting themselves in such a way that the Galatians were being, again, confronted by these concerns they had of maybe they weren't doing enough, and then these people come along and say, yeah, you're not doing enough. And you know what? You don't belong, and we're going to kick you out until you fix it. And that just gave the Galatian believers even more of that drive to be afraid, to have those doubts, and to try to pursue these things that were worthless. Because that's the point. Zeal for something that is worthless too. And Paul was his own best example of that. He'd already presented it earlier, where he talked about his zeal to destroy the church, which is what he had until he was actually confronted with the truth by the risen Lord, and everything changed for him. The drive of his opponents in Galatia was just to gain a following and to hurt Paul. It wasn't for anything good. The only thing that's worthy of that type of energy is the gospel. So we have to stay always committed to its truth, not to corruptions of it, not to false versions of it that are so common to find. And Paul is so concerned for them that they are missing the boat on this that he pops out a pretty mixed metaphor here, a pretty difficult phrase that he uses, because what he says is, you are already my children, but I'm having to give birth to you again until you give birth to Christ. And that's what he says. It is a little difficult to follow, but we can understand it. We can make sense of it, because what he's talking about is he had brought them to faith in the first place, but they were still so immature that he was in pain having to struggle with them over these things that they already knew, because he'd been the one to teach them. So he was having to start over. That's what it was like for him. I'm starting again with you people. I shouldn't have to be here, but here I am. But he was willing to do it for their sakes until Jesus came from them. In other words, until Christ was evident in their lives. So that's what this phrase means. And he wants to do this because he has, like he says, his own doubts. Not doubts about himself. He certainly didn't have any where that was concerned, but doubts about them. He feared whether they had given up on him. Even worse, if they had given up on the gospel. He wondered aloud if everything he had done for them had been for nothing. He questions and he wonders, but he also is making it clear, even if it's subtly so, that he doesn't believe that to be the case. He wouldn't believe that they were that far gone, and he makes that known to us and known to them by still calling them brothers, calling them children, calling them blessed. They still had the promise of their justification. He wanted them to make the most of it, to stop drifting from it, so that they could understand and embrace their freedom. And so in order, again, to encourage them in it, he tells them, uses another illustration from the Old Testament. That's what we find in the remainder of chapter 4 of Galatians that starts in verse 21. He says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Paul here, he's presenting some details from the lives of Ishmael and Isaac, who were the two oldest sons of Abraham. Their births are recorded in Genesis chapter 16 and Genesis chapter 21. Ishmael was the oldest, and he was born to Hagar. Now, Hagar was not Abraham's wife, Sarah was. Hagar was a slave girl who belonged to Sarah, and Sarah used her as a surrogate. And the idea was, as far as Abraham and Sarah were concerned, well, God has promised us a son. And God has promised us that Abraham, that you're going to be the father of a nation. But we're too old for Sarah to have a child at this point. And so we need to help God's plan along. And that's why we're going to bring Hagar into this situation so that she can have this child, and then I will adopt him. That was what Sarah wanted to do. And that's what Paul means when he says that this was according to the flesh, because this was their idea. This was Sarah's idea that she came up with on her own in order to try to make God's plan work, or basically to try to force it on God. And it didn't work at all. It created a really tough situation for that family, and Sarah was a big part of that. And so things went very wrong because of what they attempted to do on their own. But then, this was actually on the order of something like 20 years after that. So Sarah's even older. She's 90 at that time. But she did have her own son, Isaac. And that was clearly miraculous. That was the work of God. That was him fulfilling his promise. That was why Isaac was the son of promise rather than being according to the flesh, because it was God who made that happen. Now, after Isaac had been around for a little while, he's still very young, Ishmael did something in order to mock him. And we're not told exactly what the detail of that was. It seems kind of the best guess is he maybe said something to make fun of him for toddling because he was a toddler, and so it wasn't really that big of a deal kind of on its own. But as a result, he and his mother Hagar were cast out of Abraham's household. And the reason why was because him saying what he did about Ishmael, even as slight as it might have been, it still showed that he saw himself as Abraham's heir, saw Isaac as his lesser brother. And Sarah was furious about that and wanted him gone. Abraham actually did try to stand up for Ishmael in that situation, but then God agreed with Sarah and said what we find here, no, cast them both out. They're not going to stay here. This is not for them. Now, the Lord did provide for Ishmael and for Hagar from that point, but what he was saying is that Isaac is the one that I promised you. He's the one through whom the promises are going to go. So Ishmael can't be part of your family anymore. Now, we have to ask, why is Paul presenting this story? Why is he talking about it? The best guess is it's for the same reason that we discussed back when he brought Abraham up in the first place. It's because his opponents had first. They would have used this story as their own illustration in order to convince the Galatians that they needed to keep the law. Because what they would have said was that Ishmael represented the Gentiles, those who were outside the family of God, those who did not belong, while it was the Jewish people, as the actual physical descendants of Isaac, who were the ones who were welcome inside. And so it would have made a pretty natural illustration for them in order to say, you are outsiders, you don't belong. In order to become Christians, you have to become Jewish first. You have to keep the law, you have to be circumcised in order to be acceptable to God. And so that's why Paul took this and turned it on its head and says, no, actually, it's the Jews with their adherence to the law who are represented by Ishmael because they were attempting to live according to the flesh, because they were attempting to live by human ability and human will. And since they would fail of that, they were actually in bondage to the law that had no power to free them. So rather, it's actually Christians, regardless of their lineage, who are in the line of Isaac, because their new life comes not according to the flesh, but according to God's promise. Faith in what was accomplished by Christ in his death and resurrection. And of course, that's the cause of rejoicing. That's where Paul, what he quotes from this other place he's looking at is Isaiah 54, verse 1, the rejoice, O barren quote. That's an example of a concept that's called eucatastrophe. It's a Greek term, a compound word. The eu is EU, and that means good, and catastrophe, what it actually literally means is an overturning. And so the word was originally used in reference to an earthquake. But then, of course, it kind of expanded, and the way we know catastrophe is as a disaster. And so a eucatastrophe is a good disaster. Now, those are Greek words, but it wasn't actually a Greek term. It was coined by J.R.R. Tolkien. He was the one who came up with using that first, because it was pretty much his favorite literary device. And if you look at his stories closely, you'll see that that happens pretty frequently, where something horrible will be going on, but then somehow, miraculously, some good will come out of it. And the reason why he loved that concept so much was because of how much he saw it in Scripture. Because he knew that God deals in the eucatastrophic. And then we have that example with Sarah, how she was barren until she was 90 years old. And in her day, in her culture, that would have been a very terrible thing to have to go through, to be left without that experience. But then suddenly her emptiness was replaced by joy in having that son. A son she was so happy to have that she named him Isaac, which means laughter. And reflecting on that, in a sense, it's not the only thing he's talking about, but it's certainly part of the tradition that underlies what Isaiah has to say by talking about the barren having children. But he's actually referring to something that hadn't even happened yet by the time he was writing that. He was talking about something that would have been a few hundred years in the making, but his people at the time, the people of Judah, were eventually going to be exiled from their homeland for their disobedience to God. And that was the catastrophe that they were going to experience as they were taken to Babylon. But then good would be brought out of that when God returned them to their land and accepted them back in spite of themselves, as he promised that he would do. And so that was the good that was drawn out of it. But of course, Paul is using both of those examples in order to point to the greatest eucatastrophe of all, that of Christ, who was born of a miracle greater than Isaac's, but then died on a cross, condemned as a criminal in spite of the fact that he alone had been perfectly innocent, and dying not just for that one crime, but for all of them, taking on the curse of human sin, our condemnation. He suffered all of that. No greater disaster has ever been endured. But from it came the glory of the resurrection, bringing life where it was totally unexpected by everyone and driving away the sorrow of death. That is where justification is found. There alone. That was what the Galatians needed to know, needed to hold on to in order to not be consumed by that feeling that they had to do something. No, it was done by Christ. Now, he does say, it doesn't mean everything comes up roses, because there's going to be persecution from those who are still in bondage. We talked about this a bit last week too. The world just doesn't want to hear these things. People don't really want to be told that they're enslaving themselves. It's understandable. I think if we think back to our own circumstances, we'll know that too. And so the reaction very often is one like Ishmael's, of mockery. There's some anger. And when they react that way, it does hurt us. And the hurt can sometimes be very severe. And even if it's maybe not to the point of death sometimes, it can still be painful when it's coming from people who are close to us. And when we experience them dragging us down for what we believe. But we have to maintain our resolve in the joy that we know we will receive. And so that's persecution that comes from outside. But Paul does say something kind of curious here by bringing up again part of that story of Ishmael and Isaac, by suggesting that the church should also engage in some of this by casting people out. Now, there is something that needs to be paid attention to here, is that yes, there actually is a call for the church to engage in discipline, that there are times, now what that means is not going to be the type of persecution that the world will put Christians through, but that there are going to be people who are going to be in the church and who are not going to be proclaiming what the church believes, and so they're going to have to be asked to leave. And those situations happen, and Paul discusses those in some of his writing. Jesus himself talks about it, that this is something that does come up. There are situations that require it, and so he is saying, yes, you have these false teachers in your churches, and you need to tell them that they don't belong. But he is pointing to something even further beyond that. He's talking about the fate of those who insist on relying on their own efforts. That it's not just the church driving them out, it's God who's casting them out. Because that is what had happened with Ishmael. Sarah wanted him to leave, but he didn't actually leave until God said that he had to. And that's ultimately what's going to happen for people who try to make it on their own. They're not going to succeed, and they're going to be saying that they don't want anything to do with God, and so God's not going to give them a place in his family. And so really, this isn't telling us what we should do to people. It's telling them what we should do for people. That this is a warning. That this is what they could endure. And so it is up to us to let them know. And again, well, we have to do it lovingly, to tell them the truth so that they don't remain in that bondage. And so that's what we do here at Potter's. That's why we have a time of invitation that's included in these sermons for anyone that's here or for people who may be watching on at home to respond to think about what these things mean for you. Now, Paul, and if you look back at Galatians chapter 4, verse 12, he says there to the Galatians, "Become like me." And it's a pretty challenging thing to stand up and to do. I don't feel as comfortable with that as Paul must have. I'm not an apostle. I don't really see myself as the best example all the time for people to follow. But I will say you should become like me in this, that I know what it is to be forgiven. I know what it is to be set free from that feeling of obligation to make God owe me a place with him, and to instead find that place with him in what Christ has done instead. So yes, I will tell you to become like me in that. If anyone thinks that they can be good enough to go to heaven, I just have to tell you, no, you'll never enter it that way. So don't continue down that road. Being told that is really not supposed to be to make you feel bad. It's to help you find what you actually need, to have faith in Christ, to be born again to a life that is truly free, because that's what he's offering. So I hope that anybody who needs that will do that. As for those of us who are Christians, also in that verse, pay attention to the fact that Paul says, "I became like you." He put himself in the Galatians' shoes. Now, obviously, that didn't mean following their behavior, because their behavior was wrong. Before they were Christians, they were pagans. Now here, after they're Christians, they're trying to go into a different type of self-idolatry. And the whole point that he's presenting here is that we need to avoid the temptation of returning to that desire to justify ourselves. But he put himself in their place in order to feel their need. And that's what we should do too. By first of all remembering who you were before you knew God and what was overcome because of Christ, so that you don't have to experience that doubt, that fear of what you have to do. Because again, it's been done for you. And then to think about the chains that other people are still trying to bear, so that you can share with them the hope that God loves them and that Jesus gave his life for them. Let them know, so they won't have to be cast out.